Okay, thank you, Gal. Good morning. I hope everyone can hear me okay. We had to make some technical changes here at the last minute, but welcome. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share this topic today with all of you. Typically, this training for the CE-CERT model, I'll explain what that is in a moment, is usually about a 3-hour training. So we're kind of condensing that down. What I also tried to do is to sort of put it in the frame of where we are right now in the midst of the COVID-19 epidemic. So we want to start with the distinctive elements. We're going to call this the great stay inside, which is kind of, maybe a non-stigmatizing way of describing where we are right now. But CE-CERT began as a secondary traumatic stress model or intervention to deal with the before, during, and after an event. And you could argue right now that we're not in the after phase yet. We don't know where we are. We don't know whether we're in the middle of this pandemic. We don't know whether we're near the end. We don't know whether there's a roller coaster and we're in a lower dip of the roller coaster. We're about to climb back to another peak. We don't know where we really are in this process. It's an ongoing new situation. For the most part, for the majority of individuals, this is a low-level chronic kind of stress that goes on for 8 or however many weeks we've been in it now. For many, of course, it has been much more acute than that. And they have maybe lost loved ones, had loved ones who've become very ill, have lost businesses, have lost income, have had very stressful times at home with families, those kinds of things. So we don't want to minimize the real impact, but probably for the majority of people, it's been a low-level kind of a chronic stress that's occurred here. We do want to kind of inject a little humor in it here. So the left side is one playful meme that was developed about the person's quarantine schedule. You can take a look at that. Perhaps for some context in terms of putting this, what we're going through now, into context, some people are describing this as the worst thing that they've ever experienced and those kinds of things. And that may be based on their experience. But if we look at a larger context, for example, my parents' generation, and perhaps some of you on the call, were called to go to war for World War II. And, they're often called the greatest generation. So, for context here, we're called to stay inside and sit on the couch for the most part. We may have some struggles acquiring some of the things that we need. But, if you grew up in London during that time, you had air raid sirens going off, and Gal and many of your colleagues who in Israel know what it's like to have bombs rain down on you. And that's clearly a different experience. So while not to minimize this, there's a different sort of chronicity about this that kind of drags out. And I hope to put the CE-CERT model around that frame. So one way of saying it, hey, we got this. We can do what we're being asked to do. The CE-CERT model, CE-CERT stands for Components for Enhancing Clinician Experience and Reducing Trauma. It was developed by Dr. Brian Miller. He's a psychologist in Salt Lake City. Former clinical director for Primary Children's Hospital in Salt Lake, among a number of other accolades that he has in his resume. This is an evidence-informed model. Forget what you've heard about secondary traumatic stress that is evidence-informed or evidence-focused, because the reality is none of it is. We have very little outcome evidence on what works for managing secondary traumatic stress. It has not been adequately studied. There's a lot of things kind of thrown at it out there. A lot of those things are really around self-care strategies. Very little evidence about what aspects of those work and how they can be best adapted. So CE-CERT is an attempt to create an evidence-informed approach to this, utilizing exposure-based concepts from trauma therapy, rumination-based CBT principles, neuropsychological research that supports understanding how our default mode network works, what our task-positive focus can be, how rumination cycles work, as well as third wave treatments, acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, compassion-based therapy, metacognitive CBT, mindfulness, etc. A number of those models have been evaluated for this, as well as narrative-based treatments, concepts from occupational therapy, and other trauma-specific models like trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm a national trainer for that model. So this approach to managing secondary trauma really resonates for me. All of the terms that we hear around secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, burnout, they have some slight differences in definition, but they really have more commonalities than not. And this is not going to be a presentation about that stuff. It's more about the what to do about it based off of what the science has taught us through treating trauma. So they all have a commonality in the term, but the commonality really that's biggest for all of them is that all of those things, regardless of how we want to label them, take an emotional toll on the helper. When they're engaging someone else who has had emotional, behavioral, physical, or really now in this time, economic and maybe socially disenfranchising struggles. When someone's engaging them directly as the helper, that takes a toll on them. Our concern is when that toll begins to really take on the form and shape of post-traumatic stress and may mimic, in fact, create those full-blown symptoms. My wife and son shared with me this week a story that I missed that was on NPR about some of the individuals who were hired by, I believe it was Facebook, to review content to make sure things could or couldn't be posted on Facebook. And they were routinely and regularly exposed to very graphic and disruptive material. And many of them found that they were developing symptoms of PTSD. If you look in the DSM-5 diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder, one of the differences from DSM-4 is it talks about the fact that people can be exposed and develop post-traumatic stress symptoms from being exposed over and over again in the performance of some activity to very graphic or disruptive images, very traumatic images. So that clearly is happening. This model, while originally designed for really mental health professionals, trauma professionals, has shown effectiveness far beyond trauma. And we've trained this now for a number of populations of helpers, everything from child caseworkers to foster parents to juvenile court judges, with great effectiveness. The key to this model is the importance of conscious oversight. Conscious oversight of our own autonomic dysregulation, the helter-skelter response that spins up in us when we've been exposed to something distressful, whether it's a single time or repeatedly. So CE-CERT is best viewed as really a set of behaviors and strategies that need to become skills. And we're going to talk briefly about skills in just a moment. So there are 5 interwoven skills or domains that, in a sense, reverse engineer the negative or disruptive or aversive emotional effects that come from caring work. Excuse me. So I took a moment and I wanted to look up what the dictionary said about skills. And these are an amalgam of several different definitions from different dictionaries. The ability to do something well, expertise, a particular ability, an ability and capacity acquired through deliberate, systematic, and sustained effort to smoothly and adaptively carry out complex activities or job functions, including cognitive skills, technical skills, people skills, or interpersonal skills. See also competence. Yeah, that's a wonderful definition of skill. Also, a learned power of doing something competently, a developed aptitude. I really like that phrase, a developed aptitude. A skill is a type of work or activity which requires special training, i.e. practice and knowledge. My reason for pointing that out is this presentation will make absolutely no difference in your day or in your professional life or in your personal life. If it's just you've spent the hour, you've punched the ticket, you've gotten the CE, you've heard, I hope, some fairly interesting information. But without practice, without application, without acquiring skills, without attempt to build an aptitude, this will go nowhere. It will be completely unhelpful for you. It will be like a box of tools that sits in your garage, even though the IKEA bench is not put together yet. Without applying the tools, no skill and mastery comes into place. Therefore, no competency is developed. So I really want you to think about applying these skills in your own personal practice, professionally, but also personally. So think about which of these secondary traumatic symptoms have you identified in yourself, or maybe now your family or other colleagues that you have been exposed to. I'm not going to go through these in detail. I'm just going to run down the list, and you can identify whether any of these might resonate for you in your personal experience or with those in your life. If you feel so inclined to put something in the chat box, if you want to acknowledge that, that's great. I'm not able to look at the chat box, unfortunately, right now. So maybe those things could be some topics that we get to in the discussion piece. And clearly, this is not all of the list. There are many, many others. But you think about frustration, it's kind of the baby brother of anger. It can grow up to be anger, it can grow up to be cynicism if it's given sort of the right feeding and caring. Many folks are having chronic stress, chronic exhaustion, sleep disruptions, all kinds of things that are coming with this time that we're in. So some of those negative impacts, they can be work performance impacts, compromise the care that we give to those that we serve or provide to those we serve, but also can affect the relationships with our colleagues. Many folks are talking right now about some of the most difficult part of this time, being disconnected from their work teams or their work community. And while we're trying to do that virtually, most everyone is trying to do that virtually, you have to admit it lacks something, but also it gains something. There may be some ways in which folks are taking a little bit deeper dives in their conversations with colleagues when they're doing it now. They have a little more time. You're not doing it face to face. You may be sharing a little bit more about your family or what's happening in your home or how you're managing that kind of thing. There could also certainly be, as a result, the broader result of secondary traumatic stress, a loss of job satisfaction. You know, losing one's motivation for why we're doing this work, why we entered whatever field it is that we're in that serves others. And certainly if we feel less effective. If we're starting to feel that sort of hardening over or a disconnection from that, that really should be a sign to us. Certainly, there's a lot of data that supports that when secondary traumatic stress symptoms are not addressed, it impacts the workforce, and a lot of people will leave prematurely and move on to doing something else. And it also has a very practical side of things where we have to be concerned about ethical breaches, either where we're avoiding the persons, the members or clients, whatever terminology you use for those that you serve, because now that maybe they're not present in an office, they're not showing up at a desk and sort of checking in for an appointment or whatever your structure for where you work is, it may be, do I decide to call this person back? If you find yourself waiting until 4:50 to return a call, knowing you're probably not going to catch them, or you may not catch them, what's going on with that avoidance? What's going on with that plan to sort of do that? So there may be avoidance. There may be a lack of timely follow through because perhaps the structures that hold accountability are a little bit different, or maybe you're feeling distracted or more inattentive now. Those would be some things to be attentive and mindful to right now. So what about your home team? What are you noticing in your home community, if you will? Maybe even just in your pets. But what are you noticing with other family members or those that you may be sheltering at home with that you may be seeing that are sort of signs of the stress of this general circumstance that we're in? Those are things to really be attentive to right now. So CE-CERT has 5 main components, as I mentioned, and they're interwoven. One is not more important than the other, and they don't follow in necessarily a linear order, but they all weave together. And the components, domains are experiential engagement, decreasing rumination, conscious narrative, reducing emotional labor, and we'll talk about what each of these means, and finally, parasympathetic recovery, which are those skills to dial down the arousal in our sympathetic nervous system, which is usually what is talked about in most trauma trainings and absolutely is very valuable. But unless we're managing the cognitive and the behavioral and our reflection on those things, then we can be working very hard to reduce the parasympathetic or to engage the parasympathetic response, to reduce those arousal symptoms, and really have to do it over and over again because the cognitive and the behavioral piece keep feeding that sympathetic distress. Over all of this is this idea of conscious oversight. If any of you grew up with a sibling, no one had to tell you growing up what on purpose means. They did that on purpose. She did that on purpose. He did that on purpose. No one has to tell you what that means. You have to imply that here, though. You have to do these skills on purpose, conscious oversight to each of these components to really see a difference. So the principle here, the first main principle we're going to talk about, experiential engagement. Avoiding situations or distressful, aversive feelings interrupts the normal process where we metabolize and resolve stressful response. We have to be willing to experience those aversive experiences. Sounds kind of contradictory, but it's absolutely true. We have to fully experience those aversive, distressful events or experiences or situations, interactions, whatever they may be. Doing so prevents stress building up, but it also prevents anxiety, which tends to grow in small incremental ways and become more powerful over time. It reduces that capacity for anxiety to really gain a foothold. What it requires of us is back to that conscious attention again, that conscious intention. We're doing this on purpose. So we're targeting and paying attention to our experience and exercising conscious oversight. What is our body telling us? What are our thoughts telling us? What are our behaviors telling us, and how are they integrating? It also requires a measure of mindful non-reactivity. So rather than responding out of an emotional state, we kind of check that, pay attention to how we're feeling, and then choose not to react, and then evaluate what we've learned, what this means, what are some steps. So I know that can be a little bit confusing. I'll try to make that seem a little clearer here. So experiential engagement applied to this great inside that we're in right now. Opening up to the event, the good and the bad. So there are clearly bad sides to this, but we're hearing reports every day of people doing remarkable things to learn about, engage other people. When you hear about in Italy, when people were coming out on their balconies and singing to the care workers. In New York City, where every night, I think at 7 p.m., people opened their windows and were banging pots and doing things to make a noise to support the people who were doing frontline healthcare work. Whether people are more patient with each other, more understanding, we find ourselves in this common dilemma. And if that increases our human support for one another, that's a good thing. Some good things can come out of that. Has it made you come alive, or has it made you feel more numb? Is it more polarizing now that there are these discussions about reopening? Is that a polarizing experience? We have to be in a place to balance and accept the good and the bad of that. Noticing the edges of your feelings, both the starts and the finishes. This isn't one feeling or experience. This is a drawn out stressor that we're in right now. And it applies to our regular work when we go back to whatever the new normal will be. This still applies. What are the edges of those emotions that you notice? Do you notice a little prick of avoidance in a situation, or frustration over something? And what do you do with it? Do you try to tamp it down? Do you try to kind of swallow it, postpone it till the end of the day? Really, none of that works very well. It will pile up despite our best efforts. Whether you want it or not, you will have it. And the harder you resist having it, the greater the likelihood you will have it. And then prompts for self-reflection. Taking a reminder to pause and reflect and feel sort of the full felt sense of what's going on here. How are you feeling? I'm feeling restless with this. I'm feeling distracted. I'm feeling excited about the possibilities. I'm feeling excited that I can reach the people that I support in new and different ways, and it's creating a creative challenge for me. I'm excited by that challenge. You know, be open to the full experience of that and paying attention. Are you willing to fully engage in this experience, including the potential negative side of it? The second domain is reducing rumination. Primary emotions have a very short half-life, actually about 90 seconds. It's been shown in neuroscience. And if the negative emotion is going on longer than that, it's probably because we've kicked into a psychophysiological process of revisiting that thought and ginning back up some distressful feelings. So actually the duration of a single feeling event is only about 90 seconds. But after that primary feeling, we can recreate it by bringing it back up in our brain, in our cerebral cortex, replaying that experience, replaying that conversation, replaying what we think we should have done, or what that person did, or how we felt slighted, or how we felt disempowered, or how frustrated we feel at not getting a task done. Not, going to the store thinking you're going to get the toilet paper and the shelves are all empty. What are you thinking about as a result of that? So reducing rumination, the skill for that is learning to leave the experience in the experience. So the challenge is, how do we rest the mind? How do we get off that merry-go-round of rumination thoughts? One of the most effective tools is doing something task positive, meaning think about rumination. It actually clicks in during what the neuroscientists call the default mode network. The default mode network is a part of our neural system that kicks in when we are not actively engaged in something outside of us. It's focused on the self. So think for a moment, if you are reading a book and you got into the bottom of a full page and you realize, I don't remember anything that I've read. You've sort of kind of checked out for a moment there. Your brain probably clicked into its default mode network. Unfortunately, the science is showing that about 2/3 of the time that we spend time in our default mode network, we're thinking about dread or worry. We're replaying negative things that happen. There's a great deal of science around that, that negative interface that we do. We can have 5 compliments in a day and hear maybe 1 negative or something that we perceive as negative, 1 criticism, 1 corrective disciplinary response. That's the one we're thinking about for the rest of the day, not the 5 other compliments. We have this natural tendency to do that. You know, evolutionarily, that was helpful. When something was dangerous or problematic, we had to respond to it. But now we tend to gin those things up and ruminate on them, and nothing good comes from that. So having task positive things that you can focus on that will bring you out of it, and they don't have to take very long. They can take as little as a couple of minutes. Having a conversation with someone, shifting outside of yourself to the circumstance of the other and talking about their situation. Any activity that pulls you into focus, whether it's working on maybe a jigsaw puzzle or a good book that really is engaging for you, an activity of maybe gardening, something that you're doing with your hands, something that takes focus, writing a letter to someone where you're kind of really into the words that you're saying, the emotion you're conveying, memories of being with that person, all of those kinds of things, maybe tapping someone online and having a communication there. All of those things could be task positive. And it's, you know, I grew up in the age of records and LPs and albums. Some folks may be more on the digital side, but if you had a turntable and a record that you were playing and there was a little skip in the record, you knew you could gently bump the turntable and the needle would pop hopefully to the next groove of the record and continue playing. So it doesn't take much to bump the needle to get out of rumination, but we have to recognize we're in it in the first place. The other thing that's been shown about rumination is it tanks empathy. When we're ruminating on something, often we think, oh, I'm problem solving, I'm going to figure this out. But often what we do is we gin up more frustration. Why isn't that person following my advice? Why aren't they following the medical advice that they've been given? Why aren't they following the mental health advice that they've been given? Why aren't they returning the phone calls? We've expressed this to them over and over again, what they should do, et cetera, et cetera. It's very easy to kind of gin up less empathy as a result of that rather than more. We think we're problem solving, but it's a trap. We're really not. Rumination reduces empathy. The next, so applying rumination to, again, our little analogy of the great stay inside, we're in a low level state here of fight or flight for the most part. Again, I want to emphasize some folks are not. Some folks have been significantly impacted by this. But we have nowhere to flee and nothing to fight. So where does this churned up energy go? So the goals here are twofold: to have moments of resting our mind, to be able to get off the mental loop of the rumination, if that's what's happening, but also to avoid freezing, because that's where the freeze, the 3 F's we typically talk about for being under stress: fight, fight, or freeze. The freeze could be where we just become immobilized. We become withdrawn, focus on our own circumstance, that kind of thing. So how we reduce rumination, again, is noticing and labeling it, short-circuiting it, something as quick as 2 minutes, conversation, activity, whatever it might be, or focused conversation, and then any absorbing activity. So have some go-tos for yourself, both at home and at work, that can help you to reduce rumination when you find you're clicking into that. The third domain we want to talk about is conscious narrative. For those therapists trained in cognitive behavioral approaches, especially if they've worked in gradual exposure, trauma-focused approaches, they're probably familiar with the idea of narrative, and the focus of that is also the field of narrative therapy. So this is a more familiar concept for those folks. It involves noticing and directing the story that we're telling to ourselves about an event. And interestingly, this narrative, the story, has 3 acts, if you will. The first act is, or chapters perhaps, you might think of it that way, the antecedent one. These are the foundational narratives, what we tell ourselves before an event. And I like to break this down a little bit even further. I like to think about this antecedent narrative as a big N and a little n. The big N is, why are you doing what you're doing? If you are a healthcare or mental health care or some other kind of service professional right now, how did you arrive here? What is the path that brought you to this? And maybe it was deliberate. Maybe you went to school for a particular degree and that's what you're practicing in, or maybe you actually started in something else and now you're in a different field and you're finding that that really matches your skills and your interests and your values. But think about how you got here. That's your big N, the big N of how you arrived at what it is that you're doing. And we'll come back to the concept if you're not feeling satisfied with that. We'll come back to that in the next one. The little n of that is what you're telling yourself right before an interaction. If you think next time when you're back in the face-to-face world where you're actually dealing with a person maybe in an office setting or in a service center of some kind, when you're engaging a person directly, or maybe now it's what are you saying to yourself before you pick up a phone, before you log on to an interaction with a person? What are you saying to yourself? Is there dread? Is there disappointment? Is there a push or pull of avoidance? What's going on? And are you aware of that experience? What are you saying to yourself? Oh, I really wish this person would just not be home when I call. I dread talking to them. Or it's so uncomfortable, or they always have such big problems and I never know quite how to help with all of them, or I feel overwhelmed by everything that's going on with them. We have to be aware of what that conversation is that we're saying to ourselves, because it can be disempowering, or it can be something that clicks us into problem solving and bringing the skills on board that I talked about earlier. The concurrent narrative, chapter 2, or the second act of the play, is what's happening during the moment. What are we saying to ourselves during the moment? If you've ever been in an interaction with someone and you felt like you were being attacked by that person, whether you or your agency or some aspect of some service you've provided was being criticized and you're feeling under the gun by that, often that's a defensive response. When we go to our own response with that, then we kind of lose a few IQ points there. Our ability to focus on the problem and help redirect things goes down a little bit. So what are we saying to ourselves in the moment? Are we saying, I got this, I got the skills for this, okay, let's hear the rest of what they have to say because I have 5 ideas already about where we can go with this, or it's, oh my gosh, I've got to talk to my supervisor about this because I really don't know what to do next, or whatever it might be. Finish the sentence. What are you saying to yourself in the moment? And is it a narrative of competency, or is it a narrative of yikes? Those are going to be very different in terms of how we respond. You know what? In this time of COVID, we're not even in the consolidation narrative yet. We can't really make meaning of this event yet. But that's the third act. That's the third chapter, is the consolidation narrative. What are we saying to ourselves? What did this mean at the end of this? Looking back, wow, that went better than I thought it would go. Maybe we're saying, wow, I really see that my skills are advancing. And wow, you know, some time ago, I might not have handled something like this quite so well. What are we saying to ourselves as a result of this interaction and this experience? That's the consolidation narrative. And again, in this current situation that we're in, we're not at the end yet. We don't have the full picture to consolidate yet. So that's going to be sort of the next step for us. Our brain has evolved to really need these 3 acts to contextualize circumstances and resolve intense emotions. Excuse me. If you think about any intense experience you've been through, driving in a car and some close call happens, some big event happens, maybe something during this current storm that we're having, a tree limb falls down very close to your house, you will tell that story to someone. Being able to put things into a narrative helps us to contextualize our experience, make sense of them, and resolve intense experiences. So the conscious narrative during this great pause or this great stay inside that we're in, the antecedent narrative, you know, there will be an upside to this downside. That's a way of saying it. Or I'll be open to this experience, the good and the bad. Maybe your resolve after this will be, you know what, no matter what happens in the future, I'll never be without a 24-pack of toilet paper always in storage. You know, maybe that's your resolve after all this. The concurrent narrative is, you know, I'll be open to feelings of distress that might come with this work or this interaction or this experience. And the stress is a signal to me to do something, maybe to reach out to someone, make a plan for maybe a skill that I need to improve, something I need to learn, Or I need to have times to really rest my mind, to be able to not kick into rumination, to be able to integrate this experience. And again, we really don't know what the third act here is for COVID-19. That hasn't been written yet. But if we think about our other experiences that pre-COVID-19 that we had, what were we saying to ourselves at the end of, oh my gosh, I hope I never have to deal with something like that again? Or, you know, I did pretty well with that. Probably could have maybe done some better, had more resources, but wow, I'm going to have a way better idea about how to deal with this the next time it pops up. Or I'm so glad the progress that that person is making. I feel like I've really been helpful to them today. Or together we collaborated on some really good outcomes. That's a really helpful thing. The fourth domain is reducing emotional labor. Emotional labor is a term that comes out of occupational therapy. And what it refers to is that process of regulating experienced and displayed emotions to keep up that professional image. So what I mean by that, if you've ever done service work like waiting tables or working in a fast food restaurant or maybe behind the counter at a hotel, and on some occasions you dealt with a person who was dissatisfied about something, whether it involved you or not, but you had to keep that professional smile on. And yes, ma'am, yes, sir, I'm so sorry that happened. We'll do what we can to make this better and fix it. The energy that it takes to keep that professional persona up in the midst of a stressful situation, that's a good definition of emotional labor. It's the energy that comes out of us as we're doing these roles, trying to stay in our professional role and regulate our own experience and what emotions we're showing in the moment. So easing emotional labor, one of the best tools for that is developing compassion as a skill. Compassion, none of us are born with a compassion gene. There's no C-shaped compassion gene. We don't have a limited, it's not like a tank of gas that we see how far we can drive on. Compassion is self-perpetuating. It's a little Prius-like in terms of every time you pump the compassion brake, you charge those batteries a little bit more. So compassion as a skill, not a virtue or a inborn manifestation of some kind that you have. Wholeheartedness. And what I mean by that is you commit to that. You're all in every interaction. You're here for a purpose. It's why you, why now? Why? Well, because hopefully if someone's coming to you for service, you have a particular set of skills. You have training, you have access to resources or whatever they need. So being all in is where wholeheartedness comes in. I want to go back a moment ago. We talked earlier about, well, maybe you're feeling like this isn't the right field for you, or you didn't start out studying for maybe what you're doing now, and this path found you more than you finding it. That may be a good question to ask. Am I in the right place? Just don't ask it on your worst day. Ask it on your best day. The day that you really feel like you were successful and you accomplished a lot. That's a good day to ask yourself, is this still really where I want to be? Or do I need to go find another field to be planted in and bloom there? Another huge piece of countering emotional labor is intentional learning. When you find yourself distressed, either in the narrative process, during the moment of an interaction, or afterwards, or in the moment when you're feeling this emotional labor of, I don't know what to do with this situation, or I don't know enough about X, Y, or Z, then intentional learning might be the thing that gets activated. If it's something that challenged us, is there a skill I need to learn here? Or is there more knowledge I need to gain to be more effective at this in the future? So clicking into intentional learning. So what are the sources of emotional labor during this particular time that we're in? Well, maybe it's fighting feelings of helplessness, or suppressing our emotions, or feeling polarized in terms of how people are handling things politically, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of conversation about, we hear the term fight, flee, freeze a lot. And I think we think of them in somewhat primitive terms, like fight really means coming out like this. And sometimes fight is not at all at that level. Fighting might mean the irritability, the disconnect that we experience, the grain of frustration that gets pulled up all the time, the feeling angry at the person in front of you because they're not wearing a mask, or everyone's looking at you because you are. Maybe that feeling that gins up in you, that's your level of fight in this point. Or the flight could be when you really want to disconnect. And even though you're sheltering at home with family, you want to be apart from everyone. You want to isolate. You want to try to escape the uncomfortableness and maybe suppress some emotion. So think about how those terms, fight, flight, freeze may apply now a little differently and not in sort of that bigger version that we often hear about. But those are our sympathetic responses. So the fifth domain here is our parasympathetic recovery, when we are noticing that fight, flight, freeze process coming up. So the parasympathetic recovery is returning ourselves to kind of homeostasis. We do know from the science that even though the emotion of something, the life cycle of an emotion may only last about 90 seconds, the physiology of that can stick around for a bit longer, especially if we've replayed that event over and over in our thoughts. Then we're going to stick that physiology around much longer. But we may have shifted to a completely different thought about something, even though the physiology is still kind of churning in us. So we have to have some tools, some go-tos to reduce that physiology in real time. These might be skills for cognitive breathing. So rather than just breathing, really using it as a time to quiet the mind, to pay attention. Am I feeling disconnected? Am I feeling not compassionate? Am I feeling like a failure? Am I rethinking this thing over and over again? And I'm taking a lap on rumination. So being fully open to the experience, do that on the inhale. And on the exhale, I'm letting go of this. T.S. Eliot said it this way: teach me to care, teach me not to care. Being able to let go of those things for equanimity that are beyond our control. So what we're talking about here is not work-life balance. That's a purple unicorn. You won't find that. If you've ever had a positive event happen in your day that really excited you, that you felt really reinforced by, you felt excited about the progress of something you were able to do to help someone, do you want to forget about that? Is your work so distasteful that you want to forget about the positive part? So trying to do the work-life balance usually doesn't work. What helps is to integrate it in the moment, be aware of that in real time, be open to that experience, and allow it to work through, just like we would say for grief. Grief has no timetable on it. It will work its time in its own time. So this page reflects some tools for parasympathetic recovery during what we're calling this great stay here. Conscious oversight of your distress, ideas of dropping the anchor sort of in the moment, of, okay, I'm recognizing I'm feeling tense, or I'm feeling distressed here, my stomach is in knots. What do I need to do here to re-regulate this? Reaching out for team support, making sure that, we're doing a lot more in stay at home. We're doing a lot more sitting. Sitting is the new smoking. Get up, move around, at least 5 minutes per every hour. Do something to physically change your body position. When you get back to work, promise yourself, or maybe you're doing this now, no more sad desk lunches. Your martyrdom doesn't fit well here. Martyrdom, in fact, will probably harden your arteries. What are your end of day transitions? Do you have some things that you do? Maybe lists of accomplishments, or what you'll pick up on tomorrow, or maybe even more positively, 1 to 2 thank yous that you may send as an email or some other way of reaching out to someone, moments of gratitude and grace. Can you respond to that? And at least 20 minutes each night of what Brian calls returning to Tao. So something that you do to recenter yourself, whatever is your most helpful tool, your best tool that lines up with your values and your beliefs, is a great tool to use. So I want to end with this quote from Clifford Geertz, who's an anthropologist. And this is a really interesting thing to think about. The work of culture is to make suffering bearable. We are all in this together. We are each other's supports. But without skills and without practice, we're going to find ourselves taking a lap on the distress again and again. So that's what I have to share with you today on the CE-CERT model, and we'll get this the PowerPoint set out to you. So Gal, I'm going to try to enable the chat and make sure I'm sharing my camera.
Yeah, you can do also stop share so you can see. You will be able to see the people or their names and pictures. Right. Thank you, Roy. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And we will give you all a few seconds. If you have any question to Roy, you can also open the mic and just ask, or you can write in the chat. That would be great also.
Yeah, there's an old adage about how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And the answer to that is practice, practice, practice. Without continuous application of these skills, it's very difficult to develop competency or mastery around this. So again, skills take practice, and I would encourage folks to give this a try. Really try to integrate some of these things.
Jarila wrote to you that you are a great speaker. Thank you, Jarila, always with your good words. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you to say. I'll try to turn this into a special dessert tonight at home. It's like, hey, I was a great speaker. So, sorry, go ahead.
Also, I can tell you all that Haruv is doing training with Roy about the CE-CERT model, a full-day training. So if you are interested, after we will finish this social distancing, if you think that your organization would be interested in something like this, you can always reach out to Roy or to us, and we can figure out how to do it.
Welcome then.
So any more questions? Okay, it's look like we are going to start the weekend.
Absolutely. What better way to end something on coping with our stressors than having a little extra time? So try to take a little time to quiet your mind somewhere between now and the end of your day today.
Yeah, I hope no tornado will show up, so we will be able to be quiet and quiet our mind. Okay.
Hi, Dad.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you very much. And everyone, have a great weekend and safe, and see you next week.
All right.
Thank you.
Gal, thank you again for the opportunity to be here. Have a great weekend.